Hey, and welcome to the Hypothalamic Amenorrhea Podcast, an adulting advice podcast production. I'm Danny Sheriff, and this is the place to come if you care about getting your period regularly. This podcast aims to educate, inform, and keep you motivated on your period and HA recovery track. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, welcome to the Hypothalamic Amenorrhea Podcast. Always fun to say. I have with me a name that many of you listening will already know, and if you don't, you'll hear, and then you'll hear again and again and again. And that's Dr. Nicola Rinaldi. Yay! And she is the author, researcher of the book No Period Now What, and probably one of the people at the forefront of making the world educated in what hypothalamic amenorrhea even is. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about this podcast series. I think it's going to be great and a nice addition to the space of what's already out there. So
yes, thank you for saying that. I'm excited. I was just actually lying in bed one night and I was like, it's kind of hard for people to find the information in like a I don't know, just like one spot. There's like a podcast here and there, or maybe a nutrition podcast who has an episode on this kind of thing. But I was like, where could people maybe just get like a crash course and then figure out where to go next?
Yep.
And we are about to get into your story and into your book, but I feel like I immediately need to bring up the fact that you have a podcast coming out soon too. And I just want to hear what it's going to be about.
So the name of the podcast is, we think, going to be All In. Just talking a lot about individual recovery stories, as well as, new science that's coming out, because there's research that's being done every day on this topic, which is fantastic. It's definitely sort of exploded in awareness over the last 10 or 15 years. And so just covering, we'll have interviews with the administrators from my Facebook group, which I think is, there's a lot of knowledge there based on approving thousands of posts and sort of seeing how people react and, learning about different changes in mindset, which is one of the huge parts of HA recovery. So it's kind of going to be a smorgasbord, but it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. So it's going to be in collaboration with Florence Cleanis, who is a Beyond Body Image on Instagram. She's a body image and eating psychology coach. And so the two of us got to know each other way back before I had written my book. She was on the Fertile Thoughts board, which is sort of the genesis of the whole thing for me. And so we've been talking about it for a long time, and, we kind of going to put a stake in the ground and get it started this fall. So spring for those in Australia and the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I'm currently in Texas right now, and I don't know if you can tell, but I'm in my camper. We're on a camping trip, and I haven't got the air conditioner is really loud, so I haven't got it on right now for recording this. So by the end of this, you're going to see me like dripping in sweat, but the audio quality is worth it. Okay. I'm really excited about your podcast. I really hope that this is the first place people hear that you guys are doing
It will be, because the first time I've told anyone. So
yes, it's so cool that you guys are doing it and we're doing it, because I just want people to be able to type into Google or into iTunes like hypothalamic amenorrhea, because that's what I did, and have something valuable come up. At the moment it is valuable. At the moment your name comes up a million times on different people's shows. Yep. But no, it'll be really good, and I'm excited to see what topics you guys dive into and to hear from you more and more. So would you mind telling the listeners your story? Like actually first, what is hypothalamic amenorrhea, and then just how do you get wrapped up in all of this?
So hypothalamic amenorrhea is basically a missing period that is caused by suppression of the hypothalamus, which is a small organ in your brain that basically controls pretty much everything your body does. So it's absolutely fascinating. The hypothalamus controls your reproductive system by putting out gonadotropin releasing hormone. It controls your thyroid by putting out thyrotropin releasing hormone. It controls your adrenals by putting out corticotropin releasing hormone. It controls your body's water balance. There's another hormone called OAT, I think. That's one that I've learned about very recently, and so I need to remind myself what the name is. But it's amazing how tightly coordinated everything in our body is, especially in our hormonal and endocrine system. So the hypothalamus also takes in information from all over our bodies. So it has sensors for things like estrogen and progesterone, thyroid hormones. It has sensors for glucose and insulin and other hormones that are generated when we eat fat and protein. It has sensors for there are mechanical receptors in our stomach and esophagus that transmit to the hypothalamus. So it collects all of this information from our body and then sends out signals based on the information that's collected, telling our other hormones what to do. So hypothalamic amenorrhea generally happens when somebody is underfueling for their body in concert with some form of stress, either mental or physical stress, both of which generate other hormones like cortisol and endorphins that can suppress the hypothalamus. So basically, when you're not eating enough and you have some stress, that sends signals of suppression to the hypothalamus. And so it basically slows things down. So at an extreme, I've seen people with, low growth hormone, low prolactin, low thyroid function, and all of that ultimately comes back to the hypothalamus. Our bodies are absolutely incredible. It's just, it's amazing how tightly coordinated everything is. So when you're underfueling, your hypothalamus is basically trying to conserve energy because there are some things that have to happen in order for us to stay alive. Our heart has to pump. Our lungs have to breathe. Our brain has to work. So it's those are the number one things that our body needs to do. And it's amazing how little recognition there is of that in some of the diet spaces. Like, where you have recommendations like eat 1,200 calories a day to lose weight. It's like, that is the amount of calories that actually you just need if you're lying in bed all day doing nothing. So yeah, you're probably going to lose some weight, but it also means that your body has to make choices about what things it wants to provide energy for. And your reproductive system is an easy one to cut off because we do not need to reproduce. So that's often one of the first things to go. But other things that can happen are the body will choose to spend less energy on keeping you warm. So women that have HA also are often cold all the time. Your less energy gets spent on bone building. And that's also, something that's where estrogen and progesterone are highly involved in that process as well. So when you don't have a normal menstrual cycle, you're depleting those hormones are not where they need to be for proper bone building. You might have brittle hair and nails. There's a lot of anxiety, emotional effects, low libido, very little vaginal lubrication. I mean, there are so many side effects that, having to pee a lot because the estrogen that you normally get in a menstrual cycle, it increases 10 to 15 fold, and your progesterone increases about 20 to 40 fold during your menstrual cycle. So when those hormones aren't around, it actually causes the lining of the bladder to thin, and that means that you get the signal to urinate sooner, almost 4 times sooner than if you have a normal menstrual cycle and normal bladder function. So there's so many effects that all of this has, but it's all driven by the hypothalamus, which is that little part in your brain that controls everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely wild, but it also makes so much sense. And isn't it's like right up here in the top of your head, in the center of everything.
I think it's kind of more down
Or like
down
at the
towards
back,
the
down
base
towards
of
the
your
back.
brain. Yeah, it's
Amazing. And you were talking about how at the very beginning of that, how women, are told like these 1,200 calorie diets. I mean, just yesterday in the grocery store, I saw lose 39 pounds in 3 weeks on the
Mm-hmm.
magazine. So it's still very prominent messaging, and that is fed to us a lot more frequently
Every
than
damn day.
every single day, a lot more than, hey, did you know that your body isn't producing or doing all of these functions
Mm-hmm.
thanks to thin air? Like,
Yeah.
that's, I mean, I have so much compassion. That was definitely me. I remember the first time I ever heard the concept of, I was started diving into, why don't I have a period? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this has been going on a few years. What's up here? And then hearing for the first time, like, maybe your body does better at a higher body weight, or maybe you're too lean, and just
Mind
and
blown.
being like, well, no, I didn't even believe it at that
Uh-huh.
time. I wasn't ready for that,
Yep.
and so I was just like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life, is what, because I was so conditioned
Mm-hmm.
that it was actually the closest to being brainwashed I've probably ever been in reality, just hearing someone say that and me being so like, thinking that's so absurd.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean,
and
you're
now
so
it's just
right.
so
There's
different.
so much messaging that thin is better, regardless of anything. Thin is always better. It's supposedly healthier. It's supposedly more attractive. I mean, it's everywhere. It's starting from very young ages as well. I mean, kids start. It's in the comics that kids watch, and
Mm,
cartoons and all of that. I mean, it's the heroes and heroines are always portrayed as thin, often white, and so that messaging starts very young, and there's very
yeah,
little that pushes back against that. We don't see normal body size people a lot. It's all this, ultra thin, Barbie shape, all of the, very unrealistic, but that's what we see, and so that is what we internalize as attractive and the goal, and it's not it's not necessarily healthy.
yeah,
Healthy is definitely not what you look like. It's how your body works and how you're feeling. um, and long-term health in can definitely be compromised by continually underfueling, and and then also the exercise component that often goes along with that. Underfueled exercise is also not necessarily healthy for your body, because your body needs time and energy to repair things, and so often there can be things like stress fractures and sort of ongoing injuries that just nag and go on for a long time, because the body doesn't have enough energy to actually repair things.
yeah. Because you were also talking about the symptoms earlier to go along with that. And I think that we don't notice that we have these symptoms because they also feel so normal, which is another barrier
Mm-hmm.
in getting people to understand, like, actually what you're feeling isn't like aging, or isn't because you're in the air conditioner all day and so like your skin is dry. Like, I didn't realize personally that I had symptoms until I had started to recover, and I was like, oh, my skin's actually not like flaking off my face,
Mm-hmm.
or I don't have sleep, like crusty eyes
Oh,
anymore. And
interesting.
these are all things, yeah, which makes sense because I was just like always so tired,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's just this like ripple effect of things that I didn't realize were, if not directly attributed to it, like a
Related.
result of
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, else
Yep.
attributed to it. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. So you had asked about my story. So
Yes, please.
for me, this my journey with HA started at the end of my graduate career. So I was doing a PhD in computational biology, and I'd had a fairly normal relationship with food and exercise in my body to that point. I mean, some ups and downs in college, where I, went on a Rice Krispie diet for a little while, which Yeah, we'll leave that there. But so I was exercising a lot in graduate school because I loved it. I had picked up ice hockey and golf and volleyball. I was lifting weights with the guys in my lab, playing squash, and it was all just fun and enjoyment. And my husband was a consultant at the time, so he was away 4 to 5 nights a week. So, I had nothing better to do than go and play around with people. Um, so I think that was all fine until the lab kind of made a collective decision to go on a diet. And I was like, oh, yeah, I can stand to lose some weight. I've got love handles. I'd always wanted that elusive six pack, the vein, to be able to see the vein running down my bicep. Like, I thought, oh my God, that's so cool. I'm totally going to do that. So I did.
Right.
I mean, I severely restricted my calories. And I lost a bunch of weight in a very short amount of time. And I thought I looked great. I was getting tons of compliments. It was definitely a slippery slope. You see the weight on the scale go down and you get these compliments and you're like, oh, I want to go further. I want to do more. And I was definitely headed down a bad path. I happened to be following the blog of a friend of mine at the time, and she posted about the Minnesota starvation experiment. And so I did some reading about that, and that was a real wake up call for me because I was experiencing a lot of the symptoms that were mentioned in that, especially waking up in the middle of the night starving. And I realized, wow, I'm actually really starving I'm in semi-starvation right now. So that was kind of a wake-up call. And then around that same time, I also went off the pill to try and I'd been thinking about getting pregnant. That was sort of one of my other goals with this whole weight loss thing was I kept, I was starting to read about pregnancy and I kept reading, lose weight to have an easier time getting pregnant and lose weight to have a healthier pregnancy. I mean, that messaging is also everywhere and, can be incredibly detrimental because, I mean, for many reasons, underfueling is just not helpful for our hormonal systems in general. And, just this idea that weight is so important. Um, I think there's a lot more things that we can do to be healthy without focusing on specifically on weight loss. So anyway, I went off the pill, didn't get my period. I was like, what's going on here? So I went to see my doctor and she sort of said, well, it can take three months to get your period back after you go off the pill. So let's just wait and see what happens and come back and see me if you still don't have it. Well, I still didn't have my period 3 months later. We had talked about diet and exercise and I told her what I was doing and I sort of asked if that could be a problem. And she sort of said, you could maybe increase your food a little bit and maybe decrease your exercise a little bit. So I did that. But I mean, I was still exercising, twice a day, most days, and still under fueling. So I needed some harder guidelines around what I really needed to do. So it ended up being a long journey. I eventually got diagnosed with HA about 6 months after that, and then sort of jumped right into fertility treatments because when I went to see a reproductive endocrinologist, she told me, oh, your cycle was irregular when you were a teenager, so it's probably never going to come back again, and so we might as well start fertility treatments. So I did 4 rounds of fertility treatments that failed. So it was injectable cycles. They didn't all go particularly well. I had some that were okay, some that were not, but didn't get pregnant. And through this time, I sort of continued loosening up on my eating and exercise to some degree. And then, basically gained back all the weight that I had lost, over those months. And then we were going to do IVF because we'd had 4 failed cycles and it was kind of like, what's next? And I was just waiting for my insurance to change to cover the IVF because we're lucky enough to live in Massachusetts where it is covered under health insurance. And the doctor's like, oh, you should go on birth control. I was like, why would I go on birth control? I want to get pregnant. So I chose not to. And I actually did ovulate on my own and got pregnant. So that was sort of my story. And then when I was pregnant, I was put on modified bed rest because I was having a lot of contractions. And that's when I found the Fertile Thoughts message board. And so I started posting there. It was about hypothalamic amenorrhea, and I joined, and a lot of the stories were very similar to mine. And so I sort of shared my knowledge and what it had taken for me to get my period back. And I loved it. I loved supporting people through their journeys. I loved learning more. Every time somebody would ask a question, I would go and research it in the medical literature. And eventually it became clear that there was a need for a more sort of codified work on what was happening, why it was happening, how to recover. And so that's when I decided to write my book. It was, at the time, there was still very little in the sort of there's very little in sort of the common realm about HA in terms of blogs or news articles, that kind of thing, and certainly no other books about it. So I was like, this is my thing. And so I spent 3.5 years working on the book. It started with doing a large survey of 300 women, slightly more, who had been on that board with me. It was like 1,000 questions in the survey. And so I asked about everything from, body size history, eating history, exercise, hormones, and just compiled those data to share with people, because there was very little information about sort of what it took to recover, and what recovery rates were like, and how easy it was to get pregnant after recovery. Like, none of that was out there. So I felt like collecting that information would be really helpful. So that's sort of the major basis of my book. And then I incorporated all of the medical literature I could find, and also stories from women on the board, because I feel like the personal anecdotes make everything much more relatable than just sort of the science. So I published that in 2016 and have kind of been making it more of my life's work ever since. So I quit my job in 2018 and hung up my shingle to help people individually. And so I've been doing that along with the book, and here we are.
Yeah, I love your story. And it's kind of meant to be, because I'm sure a lot of people think, oh, Dr. Rinaldi, probably like a doctor of medical science, but actually you're like a doctor at being really, really good at reviewing data and finding patterns. And that would have been very hard for the average person to pull off such a survey. So, I mean, how convenient. So good. I love it. And I know that you recently released a couple of changes, some updates to that book. So when did you first publish the first version of No Period Now What?
So that was April of 2016.
Okay. And so what was nagging at you to edit?
So there were a couple of things. Somebody reached out to me on Twitter, actually. So there's one of the chapters in the book is a partner support chapter. So it was originally written for husbands, supporting their spouse through HA recovery. And so this person reached out to me and said, well, why just husbands? And I had it was something that had crossed my mind, and I sort of had a little bit in there. This obviously is appropriate for any partner supporting their loved one, but we're just going to use husband because it's easier. And so she's kind of like, well, that doesn't really seem right, given that there are many different relationships that people could have. And so I was like, you're right. So I went and rewrote that chapter to be more inclusive. So not just talking about husbands, but anybody, any partner, romantic or otherwise, who is supporting their loved one through HA. So that was important to me, because I feel I want to be as inclusive as possible. And, using the term husband, I think, is exclusionary, just given, there are so many different relationships. And so that was probably one of the biggest things that I wanted to change. The other was, I've learned a lot about body positivity and health at every size in the years since publishing the book. And I did feel like, certainly on the board, we were very focused still on being thin. And so there was some discussion in the book on, sort of still being negative towards larger bodies. And that's something that I've had my eyes opened more since I've written the book. And so I wanted to take some of that sort of still pressure to be thin and small out of the book as much as possible. It's not perfect still. There's still some things that I'm definitely thinking about another edition in the years to come, where I'll change, where I think I'll change some of that even more. But so there's that's it's not something that anybody would necessarily notice comparing one version to another, because it was a lot of just small changes to terminology or the way that I talked about different sizes of bodies. Using various terms, like obese or overweight, which are very negatively associated and defined in a very they're basically defined by BMI, which is not a great marker for health or anything else. So I took those words out as much as I could, and then I also added in links to various blog posts that I've written since the initial book was published on some differences in supplements and some additional data analysis that I've done, in terms of things like time to recovery, and waiting for 3 cycles before you start changing anything that you did in order to recover your period. So those are the major changes. So
was any of that the language around size and body positivity, because that's a space I'm really interested in. I am not in a bigger body, but I am in a body where my experience with HA was very confusing, because I was like, but I'm not really lean. I've never been really lean. Like, why is this happening to me? HA manifesting in women with of all different body sizes, right?
yes.
So it's the classic, I don't know, textbook, whatever you want, HA person in our mind is very thin, probably has eating disorder tendencies, if not an eating disorder. Many women in bigger bodies, there's some of us who, I had tendencies for sure. I had lost a lot of weight. I fit into the category in your book. You talk about, you don't have to be a certain size, but if you've lost this much weight at some point, what was it, like 10 pounds?
Yeah, 10 pounds. I mean, there isn't a hard and fast rule around that, but it's sort of just like, people don't think of 10 pounds as being significant, I think is my point, but that can be a big change for your body. And interestingly, I think that it's associated with leptin, which is secreted by adipose tissue. We think of fat as just being this, like, whatever, it's just this blobby stuff that we have on our bodies. But actually our fat tissue generates hormones. So it converts testosterone to estradiol. It generates leptin. It generates adiponectin, which are hormones that are all sensed by our hypothalamus and other parts of our body. So it's not just this kind of, it's not just a blobby thing. It's actually useful for many things in our
So
lives.
the science about like body fat, and it actually is more than just this like energy storage, but it creates hormones, or I have no idea how to word any of it, but I know that it has a lot of roles, including healing from injury was a really interesting one for me, and makes a lot of sense because in like football and a lot of the male related sports, like taking a off season and gaining weight and everything is associated with letting the body recover and recoup for the next season, but we just choose not to notice how that could be beneficial to other people in other walks of life. And it's just fat, like the role of your body, fat plays so much more than just, I don't know, like your status in society.
Yes.
It's really fascinating to me, and also for me has been one of the hardest parts, is just like accepting this weight gain, accepting why me, why don't my friends have to like stop dieting, and why can they continue to train really, really hard and I can't? And that comparison constantly has been very challenging.
Yeah.
But one way that I was able to help with it, I mean, it's still challenging, like, don't get me wrong, but one of the things that's been really helpful is enrolling people. And you were talking about, you had updated the section for partners in the book, which I also found really helpful by with enrolling my friends and those, just everyone around me, instead of keeping this kind of thing as a secret that I'm doing. It was way more helpful for me to come out in the open and be like, hey, this is happening to me, so don't say anything triggering, don't be supportive of me, be prepared to hear a lot about this. Did you have any other, I don't know, anecdotes, tips, or what's just your experience with people who do it silently and quietly versus those who enroll the people around them to help them recover?
I think there's a lot of fear around talking about this because, I mean, it feels personal, and it can be very hard to go against sort of this societal mantras of eat as little as possible and exercise as much as possible. And so I think people are often afraid of getting negative feedback and, being told, oh, you're doing the wrong thing, which does happen because many people are totally not aware of how all of this is interrelated and everything. But I think generally what I find is that when people do recruit others around them, that they do get a lot of support. They're obviously outliers, but for the most part, when people have, say, posted on Facebook, the overwhelming majority of responses are like, "This is, I'm so glad you're doing this. Do whatever you need to for your health." So I think that it can feel scary to take that step of sharing this very personal part of you, but it's definitely worth it. It's definitely worth it to have, a support team around you in real life. I have my Facebook groups that's great for people who aren't ready to do that. And, even as an adjunct to that, just being surrounded by women or people who are working on period recovery and having a place to go that feels safe for sharing a lot of this information and a lot of the angst around it. But overall, I would love to see more people sharing about it because I think that, periods are the basis of life, basis of human life on Earth. And, I think it's great to talk more about it and be more open. It shouldn't be something that's shameful or anything like that. I mean, we all derive from ovulation. So I think just raising awareness about how important it is to be ovulating on a regular basis for those who are biological females. I think it's great. And, my almost 13-year-old son has read my book, and so he knows a lot more about my personal life than many many kids know about their parents.
That's
But
awesome.
it's nice not to have to, I don't have to hide that from him, and it's nice that he, I think, can understand the girls around him, maybe better than the average boy, because he knows all about periods and ovulation and
Yeah.
all of that.
That's so fun. It's like Lisa Hendrickson Jacks of Fertility Friday. She talks about, she has two sons, and she's like, they're just gonna know all this stuff.
Yep.
Like, that's just the way it's gonna be. And it's so funny. I love it. I love making my husband deal with it. I like show him my fertility awareness book. I'm like, look, my temperature's probably gonna shift here, and I'm gonna see mucus, so this is what the mucus, and he's just like but it's just so fun.
Yeah, and it's funny I often talk about this with very random people because it's what I do. So I've been very interested in all of the people that I've told, there was only one like 70-plus-year-old man who was like, oh, no, I can't talk to you about that. Everyone else is just fascinated and asks me lots of questions. So, I think it's something that people are interested in, and definitely worth sharing.
Yeah, and one other really big thing, especially with sharing now, sometime between now and the next like 5 years, if it helps people to be a bit more brave about sharing. I think it's safe to say that for every one person who shares their story, you bring awareness to this to like 5 others. The amount of people who have come to me and been like, I thought I had PCOS, or like doctors couldn't figure out what's going on with me, or and like, but then you just like kept talking about this.
Yep.
And I thought, why not me look into this?
Mm-hmm.
So you're helping a lot of other people by continuing to share and spread awareness, just like any other condition.
Yes. And that is a great point about misdiagnosis as PCOS. That is actually really common, and I think it's very important to get right. So I actually have a blog post at noperiod.info/HAVS PCOS, like HA versus PCOS, and I share the chapter. I share my chapter from the book about the condition, about distinguishing between the two conditions for free, because I do think it is really important to get that diagnosis correct. So in order to have a diagnosis of PCOS, first, you do have to exclude hypothalamic amenorrhea before you diagnose PCOS. So that's number one. Second is that there are 3 criteria for a diagnosis of PCOS, and you have to have at least 2 of the 3. The first is amenorrhea or oligomenorrhea, which is periods that are more than 35 days apart. So obviously that's something that's in common between HA and PCOS, so that can't distinguish between the two. The second is an ultrasound, where they look at the number of what are called antral follicles on your ovaries, which is follicles sort of between 2 and 9 millimeters. It can be really common in somebody with HA to have a lot of follicles because you have been ovulating. So that also is very difficult to distinguish. So it's important to use very accurate criteria for a diagnosis of PCOS, which is more than 25 follicles on an ovary, or an ovarian volume of more than 10 cubic centimeters. And then finally, there is the biochemical or physical signs of hyperandrogenism. So that's elevated free testosterone, androstenedione, DHEAS, or a lot of acne that is sort of refractive to normal over-the-counter treatments. Hair growth in sort of a typically male pattern, so more on the chin, the chest. So often, if somebody has sort of HA-like lifestyle in terms of long-term caloric restriction, having lost weight, doing a lot of exercise, and they don't have elevated androgens, then HA is a much more likely diagnosis. And so I think there are a lot of people who are misdiagnosed with PCOS, which then sends them often down a rabbit hole of, oh, you have to lose weight, you have to exercise more, you have to restrict carbs, and all of those are completely antithetical to what you need to do to actually recover from HA. So it basically just makes things worse. So that's an important thing to get right.
So they present marginally similar symptoms. People still get them confused, and unfortunately, the protocol for them, both of them, are like, the protocol for PCOS can be quite damaging to someone who already has HA.
Yes. Yeah. And the protocol is not even necessarily particularly helpful for somebody who has PCOS. So if there's somebody listening who does have true bona fide PCOS, then I would very much suggest looking into alternatives to just saying weight loss and exercise more, because there can be some ways to change what you're eating or supplements to take that can be helpful, and probably more so than just focusing on being in a smaller body, which has a lot of negatives associated with it.
And you were talking about follicles for a bit there. I know that was PCOS, but I have a question about the cycle that you might just know more than me, because sometimes I think I understand, and then I learn a bit of information and I'm like, do I understand? So there's something about, like, it takes 100 days to do something, like 100 days to grow a follicle.
So there's sort of a stage of develop, like follicles do take about 100 days to develop from, I think it's primordial follicle to a dominant follicle. I think that process is about 100 days.
Okay.
But so I have heard some other people in this space say, oh, you can't get your period back before 3 months because of this 100 days to develop a follicle
This
thing.
is my question.
That is not accurate, because you often have follicles. You have follicles that arrest at different stages in your ovaries, depending on, they're just sort of going through the process. So I have seen people get their periods back within a month. Sometimes it's 18 months. I mean, it's, I don't think it's at all related to the follicular development. I think it's much more related to how suppressed your hypothalamus is when it actually gets back to a point that it can give the signal to start the follicular growth process, which takes those, so when you have HA, all of your follicles are not at that primordial stage. You still have a range of follicles across the different levels of development, which is why I think it can happen fairly quickly.
Okay. That was I was like, if it takes 100 days, but sometimes you see someone say, I went all in for 3 weeks and I got my period.
Yep.
And so basically follicles, if you have HA, you are potentially still growing follicles, but they're not maturing.
Correct.
And then sometimes going all in can really help your follicles, give them what they need to finish the development and help you get a period.
Yeah. So when I did my original survey for the book, one of the questions that I asked was, how long did it take you to recover? The median time was 5 months, and the average time was 8 months. So it was the two are different, because I think there were some people that had sort of been quote unquote working on recovery for, say, 3 years, but they just didn't know what it really meant to go all in. So they weren't actually eating enough. They hadn't cut out all of their high intensity exercise. So it did take a long time. So I noticed in my Facebook group after my book was published that there were a lot of people posting that they were getting their period back in sort of the 4, 6, 8 week range. So I did another survey, and I actually found that since my book is published, the median time to recovery is now probably closer to 3 months. And I think that is because the concept of all in is out there now. And so it's quite well defined in that you're eating a minimum of 2,500 calories a day. You're cutting out your high intensity exercise, and doing both of those things at the same time tends to lead to faster period recovery. So obviously everybody is an individual. So, it's not a guarantee for any one person. There are some people who have been all in for a long time and don't have periods back. But for the most part, I think following that protocol is definitely more beneficial to period recovery than sort of a more gradual method, shall we say.
Yeah. It's unfortunately, it's just so mental.
What's that?
To go.
Yes.
Unfortunately, going all in is super mentally challenging.
It absolutely is. And, that's why I have a 550-page book about it.
Yeah, one thing I found about, people with HA, and a big reason why I wanted to start this podcast, and I'm pumped you're starting yours, is when you're going through it, it's so mentally challenging to let go of the two things that you want to control so much, which is your food intake and your exercise.
And your body size.
Yes, and all,
Yes.
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, just all the things you want to control, you kind of can't. And maybe even having to release some of the things that cause you a lot of stress, like a super high stress job or hobby or something like that. That was definitely the case for me as well. And it's really hard to control all of those things. And because we're going every single day, we're trudging through that challenge, we actually want to be surrounding ourselves with people and content and things that are going to keep up, like lifting us up, which is what I was saying why I started this podcast. This podcast was because when, I was looking for any podcast I could find that would just like reinforce what I was doing and reinforce that I'm doing the right thing, because it's way easier to find things that reinforce the other.
Yes,
And even though I know logically what I'm supposed to be doing, it's very easy to hear something or see something or feel something that will trigger you to question what you're doing and have to run the other way.
Yep.
So surrounding yourself with that kind of information was really important for me.
Yes.
And that was a part of why this podcast was of value,
Yes,
I thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, definitely changing up who you're following on social media can be huge. I really encourage people to go out and find new people to follow, like diverse body shapes, sizes, colors, orientations, like all of that, and just kind of getting away from people who are very much in the diet culture mentality of, super controlling your food and don't eat this and don't eat that. And, don't eat this time of day. And, all of that is just, it's not helpful for recovery. So unfollowing or muting or whatever, and searching for people who are more positive about changes in body shape and size and, that can help you. I think one of the biggest parts of recovery is not just getting your period back. That's awesome, but it's the freedom from feeling like you have to control everything. It's being able to just eat and not think about food all day long. It's being able to enjoy moving your body without feeling tied to it. All of that is honestly so much more valuable in the long run than just getting your period back.
Absolutely. This is like my number one thing that I share with people is, and goes with our talk about symptoms you didn't even know you had, which is, I had no idea how much I was wishing the day away. Like, I wanted the time to go faster so I could get to my next meal, or like wanting to go to bed early because otherwise I'm going to keep thinking about food, and feeling too tired to do other things. And the amount of effort that goes into, say, tracking your food and working out all of the time, I would not have this podcast and all the other podcasts that I have now. I wouldn't be doing art commissions and like building a community around my artwork, because I was so busy doing those things. None of that existed. And as well, being so deep in those thoughts also made me feel like, oh, I'm not worthy of those things. I don't have the, I don't know, like the look, or like I don't have what other successful people have. It's actually crazy how your self-perception is affected, and physically your time is taken up, and your energy for doing creative things.
Yes, absolutely.
All for this one endeavor. Yeah, it was absolutely mind-blowing for me. And I just want to encourage anyone out there, don't just twiddle your thumbs either. Like, pick up something exciting and creative that is going to really make it so much more worth your while. Not just getting your period back,
Yes, absolutely.
Love it. You were talking a little bit about unfollowing people who are maybe don't know necessarily what the effect of the information they're putting out there is. Are you seeing a shift in the wellness and health industry much over the past few years?
There is definitely an increase in awareness of what it takes to properly fuel your body. It's a little hard for me to say because I just don't follow anybody who's in the other mindset. So I'm kind of in my little bubble, and I feel like the bubble is getting bigger. Some people like Stephanie Buttermore, whom I spoke with, and she went all in, and she's got 1 million YouTube followers. So that's amazing to get a different message out there. And it's interesting because she did get some negative feedback, but overwhelmingly the feedback that she got from people was positive. So I think that's been really interesting to see that, and I hope that others will sort of follow along that same path, realizing that being teeny tiny and all of that is it's just not, I don't know, it's a less interesting life. I mean, I hate to, I don't mean to criticize, but it's I think it's hard when you're in that to see how much of your time and energy is taken up just focusing on your body and yourself, and having a little bit more energy to spend on the world around you and other things, I think is awesome. So
Yeah. Well, there's this misconception, I think, that you can't do those things until you finish accomplishing
mhm.
this thing, which is being teeny tiny. But that is a never ending situation that you're going to be in. Yeah. And Stephanie Buttermore, what happened with her, like, I have so much compassion as well for I guess, for her and for the people who had negative things to say, because, like I had said earlier, it's like I'm in a cult and you're telling me something different.
Mhm.
And people are so, protective of their thought pattern. And for her to come out and be like, "Hey, I know the last however many years of my videos have been about me honestly looking a little bit scary, and now this is what I'm doing." Like, that could be offensive to some people. And so, and like, that's what happened to me. So you just give them time, and it's like the first time they heard it was Stephanie Buttermore. Okay, sure, they'll hear it again and again and again, and it's going to become easier for them to consume. Hmm. Bless. Bless. I don't want to, like, I'm loving this conversation. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I do have some other
Sure,
questions.
go ahead.
You were talking about in general studies, and there's not a lot out there in the Google why is my period missing kind of world. But people are doing more and more studies, and you recently, along with some other people, were promoting people helping to sign up for a study in California that they were
Mhm.
doing. And I'm curious, do you know if that's done yet, or when that's going to be done, or what they were even doing?
So that was Dr. Cassandra Schufelt at, I think, the Mayo Clinic in California. Uh, Mayo Clinic, no, the clinic is wrong, but Dr. Cassandra Schufelt. So she was interested in looking at the effects of HA on heart function. So she was recruiting people that have HA, and then either putting them on an estradiol patch or a placebo, and just to see, and then doing some measurements around heart function to see what the differences are. So that there have been suggestions in the literature to this point that HA can negatively affect heart function. A lot of the research is based on women who are postmenopausal, which in many ways is a good proxy for HA, because basically, when you're postmenopausal, you no longer have your menstrual cycles. Your estradiol tends to be consistently low. Your progesterone is consistently low, which is the state that you're essentially in when you have HA. You're not getting the normal increase in estradiol that happens as your follicle grows and matures. You're not getting the increase in progesterone that happens after ovulation. So I think in some ways it's reasonable to draw inferences from someone who is postmenopausal to someone that has HA, but it's not ideal. So I think doing some of the studies in women that actually have HA can give us a lot more information, and so that's why I think Dr. Schufeld's study is groundbreaking, and hopefully when she publishes it in a year or two after having done all the data analysis and
Yeah.
everything, it'll give us a lot more good information about the heart effects of HA. So the bone effects are pretty much undeniable. The heart effects are less. Again, that's based a lot on inference. And then the other long-term effect that I found from looking at the research in postmenopausal women is potential earlier brain neurodegeneration. So Parkinson's, just other neurodegenerative diseases, where we seem to be protected by having the higher levels of estradiol when we're pre-menopausal. So that's kind of like just a wild out there theory. There's really no evidence to support it in somebody who has HA, and that would be a very hard experiment to do. But I do know that a lot of women that have HA report to me that they feel foggy. They feel like they can't really think as well as they used to, and they find that when they do eat more and fuel their bodies properly, that they do recover some of that brain function. So it's not completely wackadoodle. So
and it's definitely going to be the case significantly for some people. Some people are probably going to notice less of that, but more of a physical change. Yeah, it's super hard. You might just have to do another survey. One day.
It's on my list of things to do. But with COVID, this is all way more challenging because I now have 3 children at home with me full time, and that leaves very little time for doing anything else.
Nice.
I did want to go back to one other thing that you were talking about earlier, which is the comparison. And I think that it's very easy for us to compare ourselves to others, but we have to remember that we are each unique individuals with a unique genetic background, a unique relationship with food and exercise. And so, it's really not helpful to compare to other people because their journeys are different, and it doesn't matter, honestly, if someone else is able to eat air and exercise 47 hours a day and you can't, because that's their journey. It's not yours. And so you really have to focus on what is right for you in your time of life, and look at it that way. And we also never know the truth about someone else's story. I mean, I think a lot of people are on birth control pills, and so they think that they are getting their periods, but actually it's just an artificial bleed that really tells you nothing about the health of your menstrual function. So that's an important thing to realize as well, is, if you are somebody who's sort of chronically underfueling, exercising a lot, it might be worth going off the pill for a little while just to see what happens and see if you do actually get your natural menstrual cycles. And maybe think about a non-hormonal method of birth control instead, because there is a lot of benefit to having those monthly changes in estradiol and progesterone and all of the other hormones that are associated with the menstrual cycles, which you don't get from birth control pills.
Yeah, speaking of birth control pills, is there much of a difference between HA with people who have just come off hormonal birth control and people who have HA having not been on birth control for like 10 years, which is me? I hadn't been on it for 10 years and I still had it. Like, do some people get HA just because they're on the pill? Or is it always like they're on the pill and they're at an energy deficiency?
Yeah, I haven't seen anyone that has HA simply from being on the pill. It's in everyone that I have spoken with. It's the underfueling, the exercise, the mental stress, the weight loss, and it's just masked by being on the pill. So when you come off, you often don't get your cycle. There's some interesting, I'm actually just about to do a post on this on my Instagram, about birth control pills and how long you should wait after coming off before kind of doing further investigation. There have been a couple of studies recently that find that women, 95% of women ovulate within 45 days after coming off the birth control pill. So if you're in that 5% that doesn't, then I would suggest starting investigation, basically immediately, rather than waiting 3 months or 6 months or a year. I mean, it's definitely, you should ovulate fairly quickly after you come off the pill. Depo-Provera is a little bit different. That's the injection. Honestly, if anyone listening is on that, I would really suggest trying a different form of birth control, because that seems to be worst for bone density and also worst for longer term effects after you come off it. So that one is a little bit different, but just the typical birth control pill, you should ovulate within 45 days after stopping it.
Okay. And with that, so you have 3 boys?
Yes.
2 boys?
3.
3 boys. Yep. You were telling us in your story at the beginning, just to go all the way back to the beginning, you had taken a break from IVF?
We were waiting to do IVF, yes.
Yeah, okay. You had, right. So you were waiting to do that. So you were kind of doing that old thing of like, I'm just going to stop worrying about all of this for a bit. And so you ovulated and got pregnant before you had a period. Were you one of those people?
So I had a bleed from my previous injectable cycle. So I was on cycle day 44 when I ovulated, and I did get pregnant. But so it is perfectly possible to get pregnant on your very first ovulation, which would happen before you have your period.
Is this something that you recommend people because I don't think you were intentional with that, or you were intentional with
Yes,
that?
I figured it
intentional.
didn't hurt to try. I mean, I didn't have high hopes
Okay.
given that we'd already had 4 failed injectable cycles, but I was like, might as well give it a shot. And sure enough, it
Right.
worked.
It
So
was a
I have not
routine.
found any evidence to suggest that there is a negative impact of getting pregnant on your first ovulation. I talk about it in the book. There's no higher rate of miscarriage. There doesn't seem to be any higher rate of pregnancy complications. So there's, as far as any data that I've seen, there's no reason to avoid pregnancy. On any ovulation that you have, basically. So, I mean, obviously there can be random situations if your doctor tells you not, but just in general, if you're recovering from HA, there's no reason not to try and get pregnant anytime.
That is so comforting.
Yeah, I have a lot of data in the book and a lot of data around pregnancy and getting pregnant. And that's definitely one of the things that I found was that there doesn't seem to be a long-term harm fertility wise to having had HA. So the rates of pregnancy follow are very similar to what you see in sort of quote unquote normal populations in the medical literature. The rates of miscarriage are almost identical, so there really doesn't seem to be a negative impact on that front.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I'll just cross my next question off then. That's what that was. Last question, but any idea how the medical system is coming along with helping women with this kind of diagnosis?
I don't have a good sense of that. There are a number of doctors who are unaware of HA and will either say, oh, it's unexplained, or, oh, no, it's not HA because you're not the right body size. Or, your eating and exercise are fine. Don't change your eating and exercise habits because they're good. So that's definitely sort of on my long-term list of things to do, is to try and figure out ways to raise awareness in the medical community. I've been told that it's a topic that's not really covered in medical school, and that if it is, the answer is birth control pills. So that's a very common response that people get from their doctors is, oh, just, you don't have a cycle, just go on birth control pills, it'll be fine.
Or progesterone challenge.
So
that was what I got.
The progesterone challenge is that's typically to help with diagnosis, although some doctors will say, oh, just do progesterone 3 times a year or 4 times a year and you'll be fine. But again, that's not getting to the root of the issue, which is very fixable. I mean, it's, your hypothalamus is not broken, your pituitary gland is not broken, it's just shut down. And it's our body protecting itself. It's actually biology working just the way it's supposed to. So I think it's just, in many cases, a lack of knowledge. And it's the percentage of people that experience HA, I think I've seen is sort of around 1% of the population. So many doctors aren't seeing it. I mean, I'm good friends with one of the top reproductive endocrinologists here in Massachusetts, Dr. Samuel Pang, who's at the Boston IVF Center. And he has told me that he only sees 1 to 2 HA patients in a year. So, for your average general physician, they might see 1 every 5 or 10 years. And so it kind of makes sense that it's not something that's sort of top of their list to understand or to know about, versus PCOS, which is more like 10 to 15% of the population. So your average doctor is going to see a lot more PCOS patients. So,
well, I do wonder how much of that is because the amount of years I had HA and went to the doctor and just never brought it up.
Yep.
It wasn't on my list of concerns. It was very convenient, in fact. Or if it was, there was like a bit of a brush over because they'll only want to choose the first 1 or 2 things you're in for. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but my experience with the doctor is you go in for like your main priority. If you're lucky, you can mention something else, and there's no way that they're even going to touch the other things on the list because they need to keep moving.
Yeah.
So you kind of need to go in for that issue if you want to get that looked at.
Yeah, I saw somewhere a really
experience.
interesting idea of if you have a number of concerns you want to bring up with your doctor, just writing them down and handing the doctor a paper with that list of things, because then it's much easier for them to check off, like, okay, we talked about this, we talked about this, we talked about this, and you don't feel like, oh, I don't have time, there's not enough time to bring that up. So I thought that was a really interesting idea. I have no idea where I saw it, but it stuck with me.
Yeah,
clearly,
that's
so.
true. That's true, because then otherwise you're expecting them to remember everything you just said or to ask you, and what else, which isn't going to happen.
And you don't always remember either in the moment, because it's not always a completely comfortable situation. And
Cool. Well, before I exit, maybe an overview of what people can expect from your book if they go and get it, and just anything else you want to leave us with that maybe we haven't spoken about that's really important to get across.
So the book is 5 sections. The first one is kind of just all about HA, diagnosis, the typical things that cause it, understanding menstrual cycles, the negative possible effects. The second section is all about recovery. So it's about how much to eat, what kinds of things to eat, support for making those changes, which I think is hugely important, because it's very easy, as we were talking about before, it's very easy to say, oh, eat 2,500 calories, but to actually go and do it can be way more challenging than that. We talk about exercise and the recommended changes for exercise, and again, support in making those changes. My co-author Stephanie wrote a chapter on, if you're a runner, like, stopping running can be incredibly challenging because you have this whole community around you, and so finding ways to deal with that loss at the same time that you are making these changes can be a challenge. The third section is all about getting pregnant, everything from natural pregnancy, luteal phase, tracking your ovulation, and then I talk about the different levels of fertility treatment, so ovulation induction with medicines like Clomid and Femara, injectable cycles, IVF. The fourth section is sort of what comes after, so pregnancy, miscarriage, postpartum, getting your cycles back, and then just general life after recovery and sort of living with the newfound freedom, but not sliding back into HA with challenging personal situations. And then the final section is a collection of stories from the board. So just sort of following individual people from, the start of their journey when they joined, all the way through getting their period back, pregnancy, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, it's good, and it's available PDF and paperback, right?
So the ebook is only available on my website, which is noperiod.info/book. Amazon takes 65% of the sale price of any ebook, and I was like, I'm not sorry. I spent 3.5 years of my life on this. I'm not giving you 65% for hosting the file. So the paperbacks are available through Amazon or through my website as well.
Definitely put links in the show notes, and that's an interesting tidbit about anyone considering publishing on Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to support authors, if you can purchase the book directly from them, then that's, obviously going to get more of the funds to the author than to the big corporations. So, yay, little people.
Yeah, no, exactly, right? Shop small, promote small. Yes. I love it. Yes. Well, I can't thank you enough. We covered a lot of stuff, and I could have kept going. It's a totally loaded topic. It's really, really interesting. I'm so excited about your podcast, All In, working title, and good luck with that.
Thank you, and I'm equally as excited to hear from the other guests that you have coming on. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll have some cool ones on, some good stories from my husband will come on as a HAB, husbands and boyfriends, or maybe HAP, husbands and partners, of of people with HA and just other. I'm going to have exercise physiologists come on. You're going to be one of the first episodes. So this is just people can look forward to. Exercise physiologists, spiritual coaches, nutrition coaches. I just want to get everyone's experience and perspective on it. And it's going to be great.
Yes.
So y'all can follow Nicola at no period now what. That's correct, right?
Yes.
That's your main pipe. And then links to her website are going to be in the show notes. And keep an eye out for that podcast coming in fall 2020.
Very cool. Thanks for having me.